My name is Noden, and I have to tell you this. The official report on the surveyor who went missing near our village is a lie. They closed the case, filed it away as an accident, a man lost to the unforgiving wilderness of northern Ontario. But they filed the wrong report. I know what really happened, because the secret they were looking for isn't buried under the snow. I'm carrying it. It's heavy. For the first 20 years of my life, Silas was just the old man at the edge of the village who never spoke. We were told it was respect, that his silence held the wisdom of the Anishinaabe. The truth is that for 40 years, his silence was a cage holding back a monster. And when he finally broke it, he wasn't speaking to us. He was speaking to it. I'm telling you this because his silence is mine now, and I can't bear the weight of it alone anymore. The silence is a cage. Our village, Anwatin, isn't on most maps. You won't find it on a GPS. It's a handful of families, a small clearing carved out of the vast boreal forest, a place where the soundscape is binary. It's either the high, thin drone of black flies in the humid summer, or the profound, heavy silence of snow in winter. The kind of quiet that has weight, that presses on your eardrums until you can hear your own blood pumping. My credibility is this place. It's the sharp, resinous scent of pine and damp earth that clings to everything. It's the specific, sharp creak crunch of snowshoes on crusted snow when it's 30 below zero. It's the way our town's single diesel generator coughs and sputters to life right at dusk, a lonely mechanical heartbeat against the encroaching darkness. This place is real, and the things that live in its shadows are, too. This isn't a story, it's a warning. Silas lived in that silence. For 40 years, not a word. We were children, and we'd dare each other to get him to speak. We'd leave him little gifts, wave as we passed his small, weathered cabin, but we'd only ever get a slow, deliberate nod in return. The elders would shush us. Show respect, they'd say. His quiet keeps the old ways safe. They were right, but not in the way they meant. His quiet wasn't about preserving tradition. It was a constant, exhausting act of containment. A dam holding back a flood. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened when that dam finally broke. I'll tell you about the sound he made, the real reason he was silent, and why the officials will never, ever find the truth about what happened to that surveyor. Because the truth isn't lost, it's being fed, and the price of forgetting is too high. Before all this, my own wound was a modern one, a quiet shame. I felt disconnected from the stories my nokomis, my grandmother, told around the fire, the tales of the forest, of spirits and pacts. They felt like echoes from a world that wasn't mine. The traditions felt like costumes. I stayed in Anwatin for her, because her hands were getting frail and her memory was starting to fray around the edges. But my dreams were full of concrete and streetlights. I wanted the noise and anonymity of Toronto. That life felt real, tangible. This place, our village, it felt like I was living in someone else's memory. I was just biding my time, waiting for an ending that would be my beginning. I didn't know that the real story, the one that would define my entire existence, was waiting just beyond the tree line. A story that bleeds. It all started with a sound. Or rather, the breaking of a silence that had defined my entire world. The winter the surveyor, a man named Patterson, went missing was the coldest in a generation. The snows came in early October and didn't stop. A relentless white siege that buried the paths, muffled the world, and drove every living thing into hiding. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that bit at any exposed skin and made the very air feel brittle. It was in the heart of that deep, frozen quiet that it began. Not with a shout or a scream that you might expect. It was a small, persistent noise drifting from Silas's cabin, the one closest to the woods. Silas, who was frail and bedridden. Silas, who hadn't made a voluntary sound in my lifetime. It was the last thing any of us ever expected to hear. A sound that hasn't stopped. The sound was a tapping. A slow, unnervingly rhythmic tapping on the cheap wooden headboard of his sickbed. It was sharp enough to cut through the insulating layers of snow and distance. 1, 2. Posa curta. 1, 2, 3. A beat of silence, long enough for you to think it was over. Then, Again, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It was the only man-made sound in the village, besides the low, constant hum of the generator that powered our lights. It didn't sound like a mindless fidget. It felt measured, intentional. It was a pulse where there should have been none. A signal broadcast into the vast, indifferent cold of the Canadian Shield. That relentless rhythm, it was like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. It was the beginning of the end of my old life. A countdown. The nurse who came up from Sudbury twice a month, a practical woman named Diane with tired eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, she dismissed it immediately. Benign myoclonus, she said, writing in her chart. Dementia. The brain sends out garbled signals. It's just noise. She'd seen it 100 times. My grandmother, her face etched with a familiar worry, just nodded and thanked her. But I saw something else flicker in my Nokomis's eyes. It was the same distant fear she had when she spoke of the Wendigo, of the hunger that walks. I didn't believe it was random. 40 years of absolute, disciplined silence doesn't just crumble into a noise. It felt like a language, a code. He wasn't losing his mind. He was finally using it for its intended purpose. He was making a call. 40 years of silence doesn't just break. So I started listening, properly listening. I'd turn off the small radio in my room, ignoring the distant crackle of a hockey game from some far-off city. I'd sit by the icy glass of my window, my breath fogging the pain, and I would just wait. The tapping wasn't constant, which made it even more unsettling. It would begin predictably, just as the aurora borealis began to fade and the temperature plunged to its absolute lowest point, that dead zone a few hours before dawn, the coldest, darkest, most vulnerable part of the night. The tapping felt like an answer to the cold itself, an acknowledgement. And that old phrase the elders used, one I'd always dismissed, it started to circle in my mind like a wolf. The hunger that winter leaves behind must be fed. I was beginning to understand it wasn't a metaphor. The strangest part was how no one else spoke of it. It was a thread of sound in the fabric of our winter, but it was a thread everyone collectively ignored. You could hear it if you stepped outside to fetch firewood, a faint, metronomic tock-tock, tock-tock-tock from the edge of the clearing. But it was just absorbed. It became another hardship to be endured, another strange noise in a place that was full of them, the crack of a tree limb under the weight of ice, the mournful howl of the wind funneling between the hills. But for me, it was a splinter in my mind that I couldn't ignore. Why that exact rhythm? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It was too precise to be an accident. It wasn't a symptom. It was a message. And with a cold dread that settled deep in my stomach, I felt that I was the one who was meant to hear it. I had a choice. It was a clear fork in the road of my life. I could have listened to Diane the nurse. I could have accepted the easy, clinical explanation. I could have focused on my plans, on saving enough money from trapping to finally buy that one-way bus ticket south when the spring thaw came. Forget the creepy tapping from the dying old man. Forget the heavy, watchful silence of this forest. Forget the stories. That was the easy path, the sane path. But I didn't take it. Lying in my bed that night, hearing the rhythm through my own wall, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, I made the decision. I chose to believe it was a code. I chose to believe it mattered. I would find out who, or what, Silas had been keeping quiet about for 4 decades, and I would find out what it wanted. And with that choice, a door slammed shut behind me. The life I dreamed of, the noisy, anonymous, brightly lit life in a city, it just evaporated. It became a ghost, a story I used to tell myself. I didn't tell my grandmother what I was thinking. I didn't mention it to my cousins or the other men in the village. This suspicion, this quiet, obsessive investigation, it became my own secret, my own silence, running parallel to the one Silas had kept for so long. I am breaking that silence right now. For you. I have to. Because the official story is a comfortable lie designed to keep the world orderly, and the truth is written in a rhythm tapped out in the darkest part of the winter night. If you're brave enough to hear the rest of this story, to understand what that surveyor really found in our woods, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you stay until the very end. The silence is a cage, and I'm about to show you what's inside. My new focus became the cabin itself, not the man inside. I started watching. not just listening, but watching. Following my instinct, I began to observe the patterns of life and death around Silas's small, weathered home at the edge of our world. I saw his niece, a quiet woman named Ilara, arrive every day at dusk to leave a tray of food just inside his door. I heard the low murmur of her voice, a one-sided conversation that was never answered. But there was another routine, a secret one, a ritual that happened long after she left, in the deepest, most profound cold of the winter night. It was a pilgrimage, and it was performed with a fear so palpable it felt like a prayer. It was this hidden act, this secret choreography in the snow, that held the real key to Silas's tapping and the oppressive quiet of our village. I was no longer looking for a confession. I was looking for a conspiracy. On the coldest nights, when the moon was a sliver of ice in the sky, Ilara would emerge from her own cabin, wrapped in heavy furs. She carried a small, tightly bound parcel wrapped in deerskin. She wouldn't walk toward Silas's cabin. Instead, she walked to the edge of our cleared land, to a specific, solitary landmark, a massive, lightning-blasted hemlock tree that marked the true beginning of the deep woods. Its blackened, skeletal branches reached up into the sky like a warning. She would walk quickly, her steps sure and practiced in the deep snow, place the parcel in a hollow at the base of the dead tree, and then she would return, walking backwards for the first few steps before turning and hurrying back to the warmth of her home, never once looking back. She never crossed the line drawn by that dead tree. I watched this happen 3 times, and a new set of rules began to etch themselves into my mind. The rules were unspoken, but they were as rigid and binding as any law. You leave the offering, you never cross the line of the dead hemlock, and you never, ever go there after dark. The offering was always made just before the deepest cold settled in, the same time Silas's tapping would become most insistent. It was a transaction. The tapping wasn't a call to us, it was a demand, a reminder, an alarm ringing in a language only 2 beings seemed to understand, a dying man in a bed, and something waiting in the woods. I started to understand that old phrase in a way that chilled me to my very soul. The hunger that winter leaves behind had to be fed. It wasn't a story to scare children. It was a line item on a budget sheet kept in fear and blood. It was the rent we paid to exist on the edge of its territory. This was the real economy of Anwatin. Then Ilara fell ill. The flu that winter was vicious, and it put her in bed for a week, her fever high. Her body too weak to make the nightly walk. For 2 nights, the parcel wasn't delivered. The silence from the woods was different. It felt expectant, tense, and the tapping from Silas's cabin grew frantic, erratic. The steady 1-2, 1-2-3 rhythm was gone, replaced by a desperate, angry staccato that felt like a prelude to violence. Then, on the 3rd night, I saw a figure moving through the snow, smaller, slower. It was my Nokomi's, my grandmother. Her hands, which I knew trembled when she tried to thread a needle, were steady as she carried the deerskin parcel. The duty had passed. Seeing her, so frail, walking toward that dark tree line to appease a hunger I couldn't name. The shame I felt for my disconnect was replaced by a cold, protective fury. This was my bloodline. This was my burden. The next night, my grandmother's cough was worse. She could barely stand. I saw the deerskin parcel sitting by her door, waiting. The air outside was so cold it hurt to breathe. And from the edge of the village, I could hear it, faint but clear. 1-2, 1-2-3. It was back. The steady, demanding rhythm. It was a summons. I looked at my grandmother, asleep in her chair, her breathing shallow. I looked at the parcel, and I knew the choice had been made for me. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was an inheritance. My feet moved before my mind could argue. I pulled on my thickest boots, my heavy parka, and I picked up the offering. The rough texture of the deerskin against my gloves felt final. I was stepping into the story. I was no longer an observer. I was now a participant in this terrifying, silent pact. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against Silas's steady beat. Before I left the warm circle of light from our cabin, a terrifying, irresistible curiosity took hold of me. My fingers, clumsy with cold and fear, fumbled with the leather ties on the parcel. I had to know, what does one feed a nightmare? What is the currency of this dark treaty? I peeled back a corner of the deerskin. The sharp, smoky scent of cured venison hit me first. a thick, generous slab of it. It was sustenance, payment, but underneath it was something else, nestled in the meat, something small and hard. I pulled it out. It was a river stone, worn smooth and gray, but one side of it had been carved with a simple, spiral pattern. It was cold and heavy in my palm. It wasn't just food. This was an offering of flesh and stone, of the living and the dead, of body and, I feared, spirit. It was so much more than a simple feeding. It was a sacrament. The walk to the hemlock was the longest of my life. Every crunch of my snowshoes on the crusted snow sounded like a betrayal, an announcement of my trespass. The forest ahead was not just an absence of light. It was a presence, a heavy, watching stillness that felt ancient and intelligent. The generator hum of the village faded behind me, and I was swallowed by a silence so complete it rang in my ears. I felt like a child's drawing of a man, small and insignificant against the vast, white page of the landscape. Reaching the lightning-blasted tree, I felt a wave of pure, primal fear. This was the line, the boundary. I quickly knelt, my knee sinking into the deep powder, and placed the deerskin parcel into the dark hollow at the base of the trunk, exactly as I had seen Ilara and my grandmother do. The wood of the dead tree was cold as bone. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't obey. I scrambled backwards, away from the tree, and threw myself behind a thicket of snow-heavy spruce trees about 50 yards away. My own breathing was a roar in my ears, my breath pluming in the frigid air, instantly turning to frost on the wool of my scarf. The cold was a physical pain now, a deep ache in my bones, but the fear was worse. I was convinced it could hear my heart. I waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The world was utterly still, utterly silent. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic tapping from Silas's cabin, a faint pulse that seemed to be counting down the seconds to my own end. And then, the tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. It was a listening silence. It knew I was there. It didn't walk out of the woods. It was more like the darkness between the trees, simply resolved itself into a shape. It detached from the deeper shadows and flowed over the snow. There was no sound. For something so impossibly tall, it moved with a liquid grace that defied physics. It was unnaturally thin, a stark, vertical line of black against the white snow, its limbs too long, its form angular and wrong. It didn't look like an animal or a man. It looked like a shadow given flesh, a column of hunger and cold. It moved to the hemlock tree with a purpose that was terrifying in its simplicity. It was not exploring, it was not hunting, it was collecting. This was a routine. My presence there was the only thing that was out of place. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the gasp that was rising in my throat. I watched, paralyzed, as a long, spindly arm reached into the hollow of the tree. I heard the faint, dry rustle of the deerskin being taken. And then, I heard the sound. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the frozen air like a razor. It was a sharp, distinct crack, the sound of a large bone being snapped cleanly in two, a sound of finality. A punctuation mark at the end of a terrifying sentence. It wasn't a sound of eating or chewing, it was a sound of completion, a sign that the transaction was finished. The shape, still holding the parcel, seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, its featureless head tilted slightly in my direction, before it receded back into the woods, dissolving into the shadows from which it came as silently as it had appeared. The sound of a bone snapping clean became the proof of our terrible bargain. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen behind the spruce trees. It felt like an eternity. I waited until the first, pale gray light of dawn began to bruise the eastern sky, chasing away the deepest of the shadows. My limbs were numb, my face a mask of ice. Only then did I dare to move. Stumbling on legs that barely worked, I forced myself to walk back to the dead hemlock. My offering was gone. The hollow was empty, except it wasn't. Left in the exact spot where I had placed the parcel was a single object. It was a deer femur, polished smooth by time or handling, but it was snapped perfectly and cleanly in half. The source of the sound. This was the receipt, the proof of payment. It was a message and a warning. The exchange was complete. Holding the cold, polished bone in my trembling hand, the truth fell on me like a burial shroud. It was all real. My grandmother's stories, the elders' warnings, Silas's 40 years of silence, it was all part of this. a fragile, desperate pact made between a small pocket of humanity and a timeless, walking hunger. The tapping was the dinner bell, the offering was the meal, and this bone, this was the grim acknowledgement. This was its side of the conversation. I hadn't just delivered a meal. I had shaken hands on a contract written in a language of fear and ritual. And in that moment, standing in the dawn's cold light with the proof in my hand, I made a silent vow. I would not run. I would not tell. The secret was mine now. 40 years of silence doesn't just break. It gets passed on. The ritual became the new rhythm of my life. A nightly pilgrimage dictated by the temperature and the insistent tapping from Silas's cabin. The walk to the dead hemlock was no longer a journey into terror, but a familiar and necessary task. Like stoking the fire or hauling water. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was a known fear, a manageable one. I learned to read the different textures of the silence. There was the heavy, listening silence before I made the drop, and the empty, satisfied silence after the thing had come and gone. My world had shrunk to this nightly transaction. This grim choreography performed on a stage of snow and shadow. The sound of a bone snapping clean was no longer a shock. It was the closing of a ledger, the period at the end of a sentence. It was the sound of one more day purchased. I started to test the boundaries, driven by a need to understand the rules of this unspoken contract. One night, instead of the usual smoked venison, I left a piece of salted pork from our winter stores. The tapping from Silas's cabin had been steady, expectant. I made the drop and hid, my heart hammering. The creature came, as always, a flicker of deeper darkness against the trees. It took the parcel. The next morning, the polished, snapped femur wasn't waiting in the hollow of the tree. I found it hours later, placed neatly on the stone step of my own cabin door. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction, a quiet, clear message. This is the way it is done. It had preferences. It was paying attention. It was not just a wild hunger. It was an intelligence with rules. It was a landlord, not just a predator. My grandmother, her body growing more frail with each passing week, became my silent instructor. She couldn't make the walk anymore, but she would guide me with a glance, a pointed finger. When the toddler of a family on the other side of the clearing fell ill with a terrible, feverish cough, Nokomis just looked at me. Then, at the small buckskin pouch of ceremonial tobacco she kept on a shelf. I understood. That night, I added a generous pinch to the deerskin parcel, nestled beside the meat and the carved stone. Silas's tapping had been weak, worried. The next morning, the news spread through the village. The child's fever had broken during the night. They called it a miracle. I knew it was a transaction. We were not just appeasing a monster. We were bargaining for our lives, for our health. We were tending a god of hunger and cold. I became obsessed with the other half of the offering, the stone. Why flesh and stone? One evening, driven by a desperate curiosity, I found a unique piece of quartz by the frozen river, streaked with a vein of glittering fool's gold. I spent an hour carefully carving the familiar spiral into its surface with the tip of my knife. It felt more personal, more of a question. That night, I placed it with the venison. The next dawn, the hollow of the hemlock held a surprise. The usual deer femur was gone. In its place were two smaller objects, a piece of a clay pipe stem, worn smooth by a river, and a single, tarnished brass button from an old military-style coat. It was an answer, but one that opened a dozen more questions. It was a trade. It wasn't just taking. It was communicating in the only language it had left, a language of lost things. This dark conversation became the new pulse of Anwatin. I learned to read the forest's mood through the objects it left me. It was a grim sort of meteorology. A single, perfect raven feather meant a deep and sudden frost was coming. A shard of old, blue-patterned porcelain, likely from a teacup lost a century ago, meant a thaw was on its way, that the snow would be heavy and wet. The forest had a memory, and I was its unwilling librarian. The creature was not just a spirit of hunger. It was a historian of sorrows, a collector of everything the woods had swallowed. People, their belongings, their stories. It held it all. And with each exchange, I felt myself being pulled deeper into its world, its loneliness, its ancient and unending vigil. The pact was becoming a relationship, and that terrified me more than anything. The seasons turned. The deep, insulating snows of winter eventually gave way to the sucking mud and high-pitched drone of blackflies in a short, brutal summer. The ritual adapted. The offerings changed to smoked lake trout or beaver, the scarcest resource replacing the most abundant. The tapping from Silas's cabin softened with the warmer weather, becoming less frequent, sometimes skipping a night or two. But it never truly stopped. It became a low, persistent hum in the background of my life. A quiet reminder that the hunger doesn't sleep in the summer. It only waits. It prowls the edges. The silence is a cage, and the warm weather just gives the beast inside a longer chain. The memory of the cold and the promise of its return was all that kept the pact alive through the long, bright days. The first true test of our fragile peace came in the late autumn, with the first bite of real cold in the air and the smell of wood smoke hanging heavy over the village. It came in the form of outsiders, a trio of hunters from some city down south, their shiny new truck loaded with expensive gear that screamed of money and profound carelessness. They had loud, booming laughs, bright orange vests that were an insult to the landscape, and a casual, entitled disrespect for the land that set every nerve in my body on edge. They were the kind of men who saw the wilderness as a playground, not a living thing with teeth. They don't understand the lines we live by, the ones that are invisible but more real than any fence. Our elders, the ones who had seen this before, they tried to warn them. They did it in our quiet, indirect way. "The woods are restless this time of year," one of them said to the hunters as they bought supplies. "Game is scarce near the village. Best to stick to the main logging roads to the south." The men just laughed, patting the stocks of their high-powered rifles with gloved hands. "Don't you worry, Pops. We're not looking for squirrels. We can handle whatever this place throws at us." They saw our deep, ingrained caution as superstition, the quaint ramblings of old folk stuck in the past. They were blind to the cold, stark fear that lived behind our polite, quiet words. They couldn't hear the warning beneath the welcome, ignoring all advice. They drove their truck down the old track that led north and set up their sprawling, noisy camp less than a mile from the dead hemlock. Deep inside the boundary line, deep inside its territory, a cold knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. They were a disturbance, a rock thrown into a quiet pond, and the ripples were about to reach the shore. That night, the tapping from Silas's cabin returned with a vengeance I hadn't heard since the first days. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic 1-2, 1-2-3. It was a frantic, agitated clatter, a desperate, angry staccato that sounded like teeth chattering in a frozen skull. It was an alarm, a siren broadcasting into the dark. The pact was being violated, and the consequences were coming. Then came the sound that I had been dreading. It ripped through the late-night quiet, a noise that did not belong in our world of wind and animal calls. It was a human scream, high and ragged, a sound of pure terror that was cut brutally short. A moment of ringing, absolute silence followed, then the flat, echoing crack of a single gunshot rolled across the hills, and then nothing. A profound, listening stillness that was heavier and more final than any noise had ever been. It felt like the entire forest, every tree, every shadow, was holding its breath. The scream was an intrusion, the gunshot was an insult, and the silence that followed was the verdict. The hunger that winter leaves behind had been offered an unscheduled meal. Just before the first gray light of dawn, two of them stumbled into the village clearing. They were a ruin. One man had lost his boots and was running on the frozen ground, his feet a sickening shade of blue. The other was weeping uncontrollably, his face streaked with soot and tears, his expensive jacket torn to ribbons. They fell to their knees, babbling, their words tumbling over each other in a torrent of horrified disbelief. They spoke of a shadow that stalked their campfire, a thing that moved too fast to be real, a stick man, with eyes that glowed like dying embers. They described a creature of impossible speed and a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. The third man, the one who had fired the shot, was gone. Simply gone. We didn't have to tell them to leave. They fled. They scrambled into their truck without a word to us, fishtailed down the muddy track, and vanished, leaving behind a tent, coolers, and thousands of dollars of gear as if it were garbage. Their terror was an infection they left behind. The incident was a stark, brutal reminder of the nature of our pact. The protection was conditional. It only covered us. We were a tiny, negotiated island of safety, and the thing in the woods was the deep, cold, hungry ocean all around us. Its guardianship was not a gift. It was a jealously guarded territory line, and those men, in their ignorance and arrogance, had stumbled right across it, paying the price for all of us to see. The real price, my price, came 2 days later. It arrived in a dusty green ministry truck driven by a young, earnest-looking park ranger. A missing persons report had been filed. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. He asked if we'd seen the hunters, if we had heard anything unusual. One of the elders pointed to me. Noden knows these woods better than anyone. The ranger turned his polite, questioning gaze on me, and I looked him right in the eye and lied. I told him I'd seen their truck heading east, toward the old abandoned logging roads, hours before I heard the gunshot, which I claimed I thought was just a falling tree. A simple lie, but it felt like swallowing broken glass. I offered to help him look. I walked with the ranger for an hour, my own knowledge of the land now a weapon of deception. I pointed to a set of old moose tracks half filled with rainwater and suggested, with a feigned uncertainty, that they might be from the lost hunter, confused and heading the wrong way, south, away from the hemlock. Every word was a betrayal of a different kind. I was protecting the creature. I was protecting my village. But in doing so, I was condemning that lost man to be nothing more than a ghost story, a name in a file. That night, when I took the deerskin parcel to the tree, the ritual felt different. It was no longer just a duty. It was the price of a conspiracy. The secret was no longer just a weight I carried. It was now a crime I was committing. The ranger's visit left a poison in the air. The lie I told sat heavy in my gut, a bitter meal I had to swallow every day. But that weight was nothing compared to what followed. My grandmother, my Nokomis, she seemed to fade with the last of the autumn leaves. The incident with the hunters had taken something from her, a final spark of resilience. Her cough, once a minor winter annoyance, settled deep in her chest. She spent more of her days sleeping, and when she was awake, her eyes would drift to the window, to the dark tree line. Her expression a mixture of fear and a weariness so profound, it looked like acceptance. She stopped guiding me in the ritual. She no longer had to. She knew the burden had fully passed. Her silence became the heaviest of all. I watched her slip away, and I felt the true, crushing isolation of my inheritance. When she passed, in the dead of a quiet, snowless night, the silence she left behind was not empty. It was full of her absence, a sound so loud it deafened me to the world. The first time I walked to the dead hemlock after she was gone, the world felt fundamentally wrong. The ritual, once a terrifying duty, now felt like a hollow, lonely pantomime. Every step I took in the snow was an echo of the steps she had taken, and her absence was a physical presence walking beside me. The grief was an ache so deep in my chest I felt it might crack my ribs. I carried the deerskin parcel, the familiar weight of the venison and the carved stone inside. But it felt meaningless, a rote gesture performed in a world that had lost its meaning. Who was I doing this for anymore? For a village that lived in willful ignorance? For a monster in the woods? Or was I just trying to keep my own grandmother's memory alive by continuing her most secret and terrifying work? Reaching the blackened tree, I felt a wave of despair so complete it almost brought me to my knees. The cold was nothing. The real cold was inside me now. I knelt in the snow, the hollow at the base of the tree a dark, waiting mouth. My hands were numb, clumsy. I was about to place the parcel inside when I stopped. This couldn't be it. It wasn't enough. It felt transactional, impersonal. My grief was a scream trapped in my throat, and I needed to give it voice. My hand went to the pocket of my parka. Before we prepared her for burial, I had taken one of her favorite earrings, a simple, elegant piece of hammered silver she'd worn for as long as I could remember. I had been carrying it with me ever since, a tangible piece of her presence. Without thinking, without planning, I untied the deerskin parcel and placed the small silver earring on top of the meat. It was a stupid, impulsive, grief-stricken gesture. It was a message not for the creature, but for her. A final gift sent into the spirit world through the only postbox I knew. I wrapped it back up, placed it in the hollow, and fled. I hid in my usual spot, behind the snow-heavy spruce. But this time was different. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface. But it was overshadowed by a desperate, aching hope. I wasn't just observing a predator collecting its due. I was waiting for a response to a prayer. I was waiting for a sign that my grief had been heard, that it mattered in this vast, indifferent wilderness. When the creature finally emerged from the trees, a tall, thin silhouette against the starlight, my perspective had shifted. I didn't just see a monster. I saw another solitary being, moving through the cold and the dark, just as I was. Another creature bound to a lonely, repetitive existence. It took the parcel with its usual silent grace and receded into the shadows. This time, there was no sharp crack of a bone. There was only a profound, listening silence. A silence that held a question. The next morning, I walked to the hemlock with a sense of dread so heavy it felt like I was walking on the bottom of a lake. The offering was gone. I knelt and reached into the hollow, my heart pounding. It was empty. The snapped deer femur, the usual grim receipt, was not there. The silver earring was gone, too. A wave of crushing disappointment washed over me. My gesture had been meaningless. It had been taken just like the meat, consumed, forgotten. The creature was just a beast after all, and I was a fool for thinking it could be anything more. I had sent my grandmother's memory into a void. I stood up, the grief now sharpened by a fresh, bitter anger at my own sentimentality. I turned to leave, to go back to the empty cabin, to the empty life that was now mine. My foolish, desperate hope had been for nothing. The world was just as cold and empty as I feared. But as I turned, a flicker of movement, of impossible grace, caught my eye. It was not in the hollow, but resting gently on a small, snow-dusted branch of the dead hemlock, right at eye level. It was a single, perfect eagle feather. It was long and white, tipped with a flawless band of black, its structure immaculate, as if it had been placed there by a careful hand only moments ago. The wind was still, but the feather seemed to vibrate with a silent energy. In our tradition, in the stories my Nokomis had told me 1,000 times, an eagle feather is the highest honor. It is a sign of great respect, a connection to the Creator. It is a message from the spirit world, a conduit for strength and wisdom. It was not a receipt for a meal. It was not a trade. It was a response. It was a gesture of shared mourning. It was an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I had made. In that moment, standing in the cold morning light, the eagle feather before me, everything changed. My understanding of the creature, of the pact, of my entire world, it was shattered and rebuilt into something new and far more terrifying. This creature was not just a mindless beast driven by animal hunger. It had understood, it had recognized the significance of my gift, the grief behind the gesture, and it had responded with a symbol of profound cultural weight. It had shown something akin to empathy, and that terrified me more than its claws or its speed or its silent stalking ever had. A simple monster, you can fight or flee or appease, but a creature with sorrow in its heart, with a memory, with the capacity for respect. What do you do with that? It remembers more than we do. The old phrase echoed in my mind with a new, chilling meaning. The ritual was no longer a simple transaction. It became a conversation, a slow, cautious correspondence carried out in a language of found objects and profound silences. I never saw the snapped femur again. Instead, after my nightly offering, I would find something else waiting for me at the dawn. Small, strange, significant things. The first was a single, tarnished silver button, its face stamped with the faint image of a crown. It was from an old military-style coat, the kind of thing you'd see in the sepia-toned photographs of prospectors and trappers from the late 1800s that hung in the town hall 100 miles south. Where could it have possibly found it? It felt ancient, a piece of a story the forest had swallowed whole. And it had been given to me. It was a relic, a clue, but to what, I did not know. A few weeks later, after a week of particularly cold nights and insistent tapping from Silas's cabin, I found another piece of the puzzle. It wasn't natural. It wasn't bone or feather. It was a shard of white porcelain, its edges worn smooth by a river or time. On its curved surface was a delicate, hand-painted pattern of a tiny blue flower. It was unmistakably a piece of a teacup, an elegant, fragile thing that could not have existed in this rugged, unforgiving part of the world for over a century. I held it in my palm, and a new, startling thought took root in my mind. The creature wasn't just a hungry spirit. It was a collector of lost things. a lonely, silent historian of sorrows, gathering the last forgotten fragments of the people the wilderness had claimed. It was sharing its collection with me. It wasn't just hungry, it was lonely. This new understanding became a dangerous weight. I was trapped in a place I had never imagined. I was the guardian of my village, bound by a secret pact to protect them from a creature of immense power. But I was also now the sole confidant of that same creature, this ancient, lonely being that communicated in relics and grief. The duty to protect my village from it was now at war with a strange, terrible, and growing empathy, a need to protect it. I felt a kinship with its profound isolation, its long, silent vigil. It was a prisoner of the forest, and I was becoming a prisoner of its secret. The silence is a cage, and I was now standing on the inside of the bars, looking out. My desperate need to escape Anwatan had been replaced by a desperate, dangerous need to understand the nature of my warden. My life, which I once thought was a straight line leading south to a city, had become a circle, spiraling around the dead hemlock tree. The ritual was the center of my existence, and every offering was a question, every object left in return an answer that only deepened the mystery. I was no longer just feeding a monster to keep it at bay. I was tending to something else, something that remembered, something that mourned, and I was caught between my duty to the living and a strange, terrifying new allegiance to the damned. The line between monster and memory had begun to blur, and I was standing right on it, terrified of which way I might fall. If you're starting to feel the weight of this secret with me, if you need to know what these strange, ancient objects really mean, then please show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion, and share this with someone you think can handle the truth. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. The authorities are coming, and the real story is about to be unearthed. Our fragile, secret world was shattered not by a scream, but by the grinding sound of tires on frozen gravel. It wasn't the single, dusty green ministry truck of the Lone Ranger this time. It was a convoy. 3 white and blue Ontario provincial police cruisers and a windowless panel van, crunching their way into our quiet clearing like an invading force. Their arrival was an act of acoustic violence, the slamming of car doors, the sharp, authoritative voices, the constant, invasive crackle of police radios. It was a vocabulary of noise our village hadn't heard in a generation. The Geological Survey Company, a faceless corporation from Toronto, had finally reported its team leader, Patterson, officially missing. Our secluded corner of the world was no longer just a place on the edge of a map. It was now a crime scene. The air itself changed. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke now tainted with the faint, alien smell of exhaust fumes and a nervous, metallic tension. The silence of the forest was broken, replaced by the hum of an engine left running, a sound of impatient, external power. The leader of this invasion was a woman named Detective Moreau. She was not like the young, earnest ranger I had lied to. She was sharp, coiled, with cynical eyes that seemed to miss nothing and believe nothing. She gathered the few of us who had emerged from our cabins in the center of the clearing, her presence a cold spot in the crisp air. She didn't ask for our help. She informed us of her investigation. Her voice was flat, professional, and devoid of any respect for our ways. When one of the elders tried to explain that the deep woods were not to be disturbed, especially in the cold season, Moreau just gave a thin, dismissive smile. "I'm not investigating your local folklore, sir," she said, her voice cutting. "I'm investigating the disappearance of a Canadian citizen on Crown land. Your cooperation is not optional." Her words weren't a request. They were a statement of jurisdiction. Our traditions were not a factor in her equation. They were an obstruction, and our collective, ingrained silence was, to her, an admission of guilt. The investigation began immediately, and it felt like a violation. Moreau's team established a command post in the vacant community hall, turning our simple wooden building into a hub of alien technology. Laptops, portable printers, and large-scale topographical maps were unfurled on the tables where we held potlucks. The low, grating buzz of the survey team's drone was now joined by the higher-pitched whine of 2 police drones, which began systematically quartering the sky above the tree line. The forest, which had always been my secret keeper, the silent witness to my ritual, now felt like a fishbowl. I couldn't step outside to chop wood without feeling the unseen eyes of a camera lens on me. The feeling of being watched was constant, a low-grade fever of paranoia that I couldn't shake. The very air, once my ally, now felt like it was humming with a network of signals and surveillance, reporting my every move back to the woman with the cynical eyes and the thin, unbelieving smile. My turn came on the second day. Moreau called me into the command post. The air inside was stale, smelling of burnt coffee and ozone from the electronics. She didn't offer me a seat. She stood in front of a large map tacked to the wall, a map of my home, my hunting grounds, now gridded off into sterile, numbered sectors. She questioned me about my encounter with the first ranger, my convenient discovery of those misleading moose tracks. She spoke in a calm, almost conversational tone, but her questions were traps. "It's interesting, Mr. Noden," she said, tapping a red pin on the map far to the south of the hemlock tree. "You led the ranger here, but our initial aerial sweeps show no signs of a man wandering off in this direction. No broken branches, no fire pits, no discarded gear. It's almost as if he simply vanished into thin air, or was never here at all." My lie, which had felt so clever, now seemed like a child's clumsy drawing under her professional scrutiny. I could feel her suspicion solidify, becoming a tangible force in the room. The nightly ritual became an act of near impossible defiance. The world beyond the tree line was no longer dark and empty. Now, it was pierced by the sweeping, ghostly beams of searchlights mounted on their vehicles. I could hear the crunch of boots on snow as officers made occasional perimeter patrols. How could I walk to the hemlock? How could I make the offering without being seen? Without leading them directly to the heart of the secret? For 2 nights, I didn't go. The risk was too great, and from Silas's cabin, the tapping, which had been agitated before, now became weak, faltering, almost inaudible. A desperate, fading pulse. It was the sound of a battery dying. And in the silence from the woods, I felt a new kind of terror. Not the fear of the creature, but the fear of its desperation. An ignored hunger is a dangerous thing. The hunger that winter leaves behind must be fed. And I was failing. The pact was breaking, and I had no idea what price we would all pay for that failure. Moreau's focus, deprived of any other leads, inevitably began to narrow. Her gaze fell upon the one absolute anomaly in our village, Silas. She learned about him quickly, the silent old man, the recluse, the one who lived closest to the spot where Patterson's truck was found abandoned. In her world of motive and opportunity, he became the perfect suspect. A crazy old native, as I heard one of her officers mutter, who might have finally snapped at an outsider trespassing on his territory. Her investigation, which had been a broad net, now became a spear pointed directly at our most vulnerable point. She posted a uniformed officer in a cruiser parked just 50 yards from Silas's cabin door, a 24-hour watch. This act was a profound desecration. They were guarding the very heart of the mystery, treating the source of the countdown clock as a common criminal, blind to the fact that they were standing guard at the gates of something they couldn't possibly comprehend. The true escalation came when the technology arrived. Moreau, frustrated by the lack of physical evidence, brought in her heavy weapon, a team from the emergency response unit with advanced thermal imaging cameras. At a village meeting she'd called mandatory, she explained it with cold, clinical precision. "We'll be conducting night sweeps with thermal imagers," she announced, her eyes sweeping over our stone-faced expressions. "Anything with a body temperature higher than the ambient cold will show up on our screens like a light bulb. Animals, people, there's nowhere to hide from a heat signature." My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the threat that could not be outsmarted or lied to. The creature, my silent, shadowy correspondent. It moved without sound, but was it a living thing of flesh and blood? Did it radiate heat? Or was it, as the stories sometimes hinted, a thing of pure cold, a spirit of ice and hunger? I was about to find out, and I feared that any answer would be a death sentence. The village, once a cohesive unit bound by a shared, unspoken secret, began to fracture under the pressure. The silence that had been our shield now became a source of paranoia. People started avoiding my gaze. I would see them whispering in small groups, their eyes flicking towards me, then quickly away. Was I the weak link? Had I said too much to Moreau? Had my lie to the ranger brought this plague of officialdom down upon us? The trust that had bound our families together for generations began to corrode, replaced by suspicion and fear. We were no longer a community protecting a secret. We were a group of conspirators trapped in a shrinking room, each of us wondering who would break first. The silence is a cage, and I could feel the bars growing closer, pressing in on all of us. Moreau wasn't just hunting a man, she was methodically dismantling our entire world, brick by silent brick. The endgame was announced on the 4th day. Moreau unrolled a fresh map in the command post. Its surface covered in a tight, inescapable grid of red lines. At 600 hours tomorrow, she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. We begin a level 3 grid search. We will move shoulder to shoulder, 10 officers abreast, through every meter of Sector 7. She tapped a large, circled area on the map. Sector 7. My stomach dropped. Her finger was resting directly on the area that held the ancient, lightning-blasted hemlock tree. It was a formal, military-style invasion plan. They were going to trample the one place they must never go. They would find the hollow at the base of the tree. They might find one of the strange objects I had been left, the porcelain shard or the brass button. They would cross the boundary, breaking the oldest and most important rule. The countdown clock that Silas had started with his tapping was now reaching its final seconds. That night, the finality of it all settled over me like a shroud. The choice was no longer abstract. It was here, cold and sharp and unavoidable. I sat in my cabin, the distant crackle of a police radio a constant reminder of the siege. The air was thick with the low hum of the generator, a nervous, mechanical heartbeat counting down the hours until dawn. My hand closed around the eagle feather, which I had kept hidden in my pocket. It felt impossibly fragile. I could let them march into the woods, let them find whatever they were going to find. Maybe it would end this. But I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that it would be a bloody ending. It would mean the destruction of the creature, the end of the pact, and the violation of a trust I had inherited. Or I could do something. I could intervene, place myself between Moreau's cold, rational world and the ancient, grieving one that lived in the forest. I could sacrifice my freedom, my future, everything, to protect a secret that had become my sole purpose. My name is Nodin, and I had one night to decide who I was willing to betray. The night of the grid search arrived not with snow, but with a sheath of freezing rain. Each drop hit the windows and the frozen ground with a sharp, glassy tick, a sound like a million tiny hammers. It was an impossible night. The air was thick with the promise of violence, both from the land and from the law. I couldn't just wait for dawn. I walked across the slick, treacherous clearing to Silas's cabin, the uniformed officer in the nearby cruiser watching me with bored suspicion. I needed to see him one last time. Inside, the air was warm and still. The only sound, the faint hiss of the propane heater and the relentless ticking of the rain. Silas was a still, frail shape under a thin blanket, his eyes closed, his breathing a shallow whisper. I thought he was already gone, that the countdown he started had ended with him. I reached out to touch his hand, a final, silent goodbye. And in that moment, in that final, quiet act of farewell, the world tilted on its axis and the great, terrible secret finally broke free from its cage. His hand, which had been limp and cold, suddenly clamped down on my wrist with a strength that felt impossible, shocking. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't the clouded, vacant eyes of a man lost in dementia. They were clear, they were lucid, and fiercely, terrifyingly alive. For the first time in my life, I was truly seeing Silas, the man behind the silence. He stared into my eyes, and there was no madness there, only a desperate urgency, a need to make me understand before the last of his strength failed him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His life had been lived in silence, and he would die in it. Instead, his thumb began to tap against the pulse point on my wrist. A familiar, dreadful rhythm. 1, 2. Pause. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't a broadcast into the woods anymore. It was a direct transmission, a message meant only for me. It was the key, and he was finally, desperately, putting it into my hand. 40 years of silence doesn't just break, it finds its air. With his other hand, he pointed a trembling, skeletal finger toward a faded sepia photograph on the wall, tucked into the corner of a warped wooden frame. I leaned in close, the smell of dust and old memories filling my senses. The photo was from another time, the late 1800s. It showed two young men, not much older than I was now, dressed in heavy furs and leaning on long rifles, proud and confident against a backdrop of ancient pines. One of them had the high cheekbones and strong jawline of my own family. It was Silas's great-grandfather. The other man was a stranger, with intense eyes and a wide grin. They stood together not as employer and guide, but as partners, equals. Silas's finger trembled as he pointed from the stranger in the photo to the dark, rain-streaked window, toward a specific patch of darkness in the woods beyond the clearing. Toward the buried stone foundation of a cabin that hadn't stood in 100 years. The stranger's cabin, and I understood. The truth landed not like a feather, but like a block of ice in my gut, a cold so deep it burned. The Wendigo. It wasn't a nameless spirit of the forest. It was a man. It was him. The man in the photograph. The partner. The friend. I saw the story unfold behind my eyes. A ghost story made of historical fact. A famine winter. One of the terrible ones the elders still whispered about, when the snows were 20 feet deep and all the game vanished. The man, trapped alone in his cabin with his family, faced with an unthinkable choice. He had succumbed to the ultimate taboo, the desperate, maddening hunger that leads a man to consume his own flesh and blood. And Silas's great-grandfather, bound by duty and horror, had been forced to hunt and kill his own friend, the man who was no longer a man. But he hadn't truly died. His spirit, trapped by the horrific nature of his act, remained tethered to this land, cursed with an eternal, insatiable hunger. The tapping. It was an old trapping song they must have shared. And in that moment, the entire history of my village, the entire meaning of the ritual, reformed itself into a terrible, beautiful, heartbreaking truth. The ritual was not an act of appeasement to a monster to keep it out. It was an act of generational penance. It was an apology. A promise made a century ago by a man who had been forced to kill his friend. A promise to care for the damned soul he left behind. We weren't feeding a beast to keep it from our door. We were feeding the ghost of a man, so his spiritual hunger, his eternal memory of starvation, wouldn't drive him to take one of us. We were tending his grave. It remembers more than we do. The phrase was literal. The creature remembered its own humanity, its own horrific fall. It was a prisoner of its own sin. And my family, my village, we had been its wardens for 100 years. This is the price of forgetting. Our silence wasn't fear. It was a sacred duty to remember what everyone else had forgotten. I looked at Silas, his eyes closing, the last of his energy spent. His final message had been delivered. The torch had been passed. I knew what I had to do. The ticking of the freezing rain was a countdown to Moreau's invasion. I left Silas's cabin and walked back to my own, the officer in the cruiser watching me go, a silent, ignorant guard at the edge of a story he would never know. I took the last portion of smoked venison, the last carved riverstone. I wrapped them in the deerskin. This was not an offering of fear. It was a final act of compassion. I walked out into the night, into the cacophony of the freezing rain, and headed for the hemlock tree. I wasn't trying to be stealthy. I let my boots crunch on the icy ground. I let the branches scrape against my parka. I was a beacon. I was a target. I was drawing the lightning away from the sacred ground, preparing to sacrifice my own story to protect the real one, the one that was written in a faded photograph and 100 years of silent penance. I reached the dead hemlock, its branches coated in a thick, clear layer of ice, making it look like a sculpture of glass. I knelt, the icy water soaking through the knee of my pants. I was about to place the parcel in the hollow when the world was split apart by the harsh, white beams of two powerful flashlights. "Freeze! Up! Hands where I can see them!" Moreau's voice was sharp, triumphant. She had me. Her and another officer, their guns drawn, advanced on me through the skeletal trees. I was caught, standing at the altar of my secret religion, holding the sacrament. "Well, well, Mr. Nodin," Moreau said, her breath a cloud of victory in the frigid air. "Looks like we found where Patterson ended up. I guess you ran out of places to hide." This was it, the moment of confrontation. She saw a killer. I saw a dying man's last wish. The two worlds were about to collide, and I was the only one standing in the middle, the only one who could absorb the impact. I made my choice. I could not tell her the truth. She would hear spirit and curse, and see only the confession of a madman. So I gave her a monster she could understand. I gave her me. With a faint cry of panic, I spun around and hurled the deerskin parcel not toward the deep woods to the north, but far off into the darkness to the south, in the completely wrong direction. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice raw with calculated fear. The officers tensed. "He ran south," I yelled, pointing wildly. "A Pattison? He wanted more money for his silence on the logging. We fought. I just scared him. I swear, he just ran. South." I collapsed to my knees, burying my face in my hands, a perfect picture of a guilty man breaking down. I gave her a motive, a direction, a suspect, and a lie big enough to swallow her entire investigation. I sacrificed my name, my future, and my place in the world to send her and her entire force on a wild goose chase, to protect a truth made of sorrow and memory. Later, after the search had officially moved south, after the cruisers and the drones and the noise had finally left our village in a fragile, wounded peace, I stood alone in my cabin. I was a liar, an accomplice, a permanent ghost in my own home. But the pact was safe. I was thinking about the ritual, about the objects, when the final, devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The bones, the polished, snapped femurs it used to leave, that sharp, clean crack. I heard that first night. A deer femur is thick, hard to break so cleanly. It wasn't a deer's. My blood ran cold. It was human, too thin, too smooth, but not from a victim. No, I finally understood. It was a piece of itself, a piece of its own cursed, ever-regenerating body, a shard of the man it used to be. It wasn't leaving a trophy. It was leaving a reminder of its sin, a piece of its own damnation as a receipt. The sound of a bone snapping clean was the sound of its unending penance. My life is this ritual now. I have inherited Silas's 40 years of silence, but mine is not born of fear, but of understanding. The silence is a cage, yes, but I am not the prisoner. I am the keeper. The moral of this story isn't that monsters are real. It's that they are made, from men, by hunger and despair, and their sins leave scars on the land for generations. Sometimes, the only way to protect the living is to compassionately tend to the damned, to remember their stories so they don't have to scream them. My name is Noden, and this is my duty. This is my silence. Thank you for listening to my whole story. If this confession has meant something to you, if you understand the weight of a secret, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this story, because some truths need to be whispered. And make sure you watch the next video that's about to appear on your screen. There are more silences out there that need to be broken.